last bit of this chapter, we talked about the rise of Cahokia and then the kind of the fall and emptying out. And what Graeber Wengrow are arguing here in the second part is that in some ways these societies on the Eastern Woodlands, and we'll see some of them in the northern and southern Eastern Woodlands, are a reaction to that. And so instead of having kind of the mega city of Cahokia and the kingdoms, you have these much more egalitarian towns. You have the spread of what would become the famous Three Sisters corn, bean, squash complex, the importance of women and matrilineal dealings. They briefly tell us that some people believe that the societies that were observed during this time were in part formed or in part reacting to introduced European diseases and crops and those kinds of things and animals. But what they're trying to tell us is that actually these societies on the eastern coast of North America were a reaction to much longer and larger processes that were going on, specifically the rise and fall of Cahokia. And that they developed a much more egalitarian ideology, which can be seen in what they call the green corn ceremonies, as well as the symbolism of the looped square. This is actually from a Mississippian mound, but it's the kind of idea that there are equal sides and that the village or town itself is formed around a square. Apparently the looped square imagery is also found in various places in Europe and Norse mythology, for example, but it was developed in the Americas independently as well. Are you wondering why it looks like the Apple logo?
No, I'm wondering why. Are those birds?
They do seem to be birds.
Like, the eyes like Hercules.
Yeah. They're stylized birds. So in these places, a much more, as compared to what was going on in Cahokia, a much more egalitarian complex develops. And good thing Matt got here. They start to develop ways of life which Graeber and Wengrow say seem strikingly familiar to our own times. Why, Matt? What are they doing?
They're smoking, drinking.
Wait, hold on with the smoking and drinking. Let's start with the smoking part. What happens with this tobacco? What did they used to do with it, and what do they start doing with it now?
Well, they definitely didn't smoke it.
Well, they used to use it.
Yeah, they used to be like, sorry. The
word you're looking for is intense. It used to be if you took some tobacco, you were just going to get blasted away. So it went from being,
I guess it was more like a drug, kind of.
More like a drug, more like a hardcore drug. Like it was taken by shamans to induce trances and crazy states. So instead of doing that, they started meting it out in small doses throughout the day. And it wasn't just one person, it's like a lot of different people, and you'd go around and have it, and this is a very serious thing. It had a very ceremonial use. Actually, this book is kind of interesting. It argues that, there were ways in which the Indigenous Americans used tobacco, which were important, but some of the health incidences, they started, like everybody else, smoking cigarettes and other things when it became more commercially available. And so this book eventually argues for having a more limited and ceremonial use of tobacco, not in its cigarette form. He also mentioned drinking. Where are they drinking? What are they drinking?
Caffeinated beverages.
Caffeinated beverages, also known as the black drink, which you would think was coffee, but it's not coffee. Coffee comes to us from Yemen, actually, or what is now Yemen, and but it is a caffeinated drink, kind of like strong tea. And one of the things they say is, and this is kind of important, is that what this you observe these societies in this area doing something that would later become common in like the European Enlightenment salons, where people be sitting around smoking, talking politics, drinking coffee, or drinking caffeinated beverages. And what they're saying is, this looks an awful lot like what indigenous societies in the Americas were doing before the Europeans got a hold of it. And in fact, tobacco was marketed, or tobacco was used in Europe as a drug to be taken in small doses to focus the mind, just like it is today, a drug of small doses to focus the mind. Coffee and cigarettes, and then you can write your papers. Why are you shaking your head, Cyrus? Yes, I should not be advocating tobacco use.
Yeah, we're just saying, like, I know people who are addicted to both.
Yeah, don't do it. Don't do it. But, well, coffee apparently has, as long as you don't overdo it, has beneficial health effects. I'm not sure. I think to have beneficial effects from tobacco, you really have to go down the organic food chain a little bit more. But yeah, anyway, I'm not promoting its use. But the point is that the ways in which, well, they say something is kind of curious. They say that no doubt, this is on page 473, no doubt it would be too much to suggest that the Enlightenment itself had its first stirrings in 17th century North America. So they kind of say, it's too much to say that. It would be too much. But it's possible, perhaps, to imagine some future non-Eurocentric history where such a suggestion would not be treated as almost by definition outrageous and absurd. So they're kind of trying to say, we want to say it. We don't want to be treated as outrageous and absurd, but we'd like to say that in some ways this did come to us from, certainly tobacco use. I don't know about the black drink. Actually, the black drink, I will say, tobacco use was very widespread. The black drink seems to have been in the southwest of what is now or southeast of what is now the Americas, not necessarily throughout the whole area. Of course, those southeastern areas are where the French and Spanish were first encountering these. So, there's a point to be made. All right. So they also talk about the Osage. And we all know from Oklahoma, or what is now the Osage, what is now the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma is a smaller part of a much larger territory. I just wanted to highlight here that the Graeber Wengrow tell us that the Osage retained their independence for quite a long time. And from 1678 to 1803 had an independent trading empire throughout this region. And one of the reasons I want to highlight that is because, this is, when I was 14, this is 200 years after Columbus, that you still have these very independent indigenous communities commanding large areas and having an independent trading empire. And so we have this strange idea that, somehow a few years after 1492, everything got wrapped up. But in fact, a lot of these communities persisted much longer, and in fact, some of them became quite powerful in this system. Felicia, How did the Osage think of themselves, their history? What do they think of themselves as having done here?
Um, so they describe the author look at we're looking to their complex like cosmology and how influence their communities and richer places what was set up. And they also demonstrated that a desire to neutralize arbitrary power.
Neutralize arbitrary power. So they have these, it's like there's a kind of a complicated story, right? But at the end, they're trying to neutralize arbitrary power. And they tell this story, interestingly, as you put it, as a series of legal and intellectual discoveries, even breakthroughs. So it's kind of like this political history of themselves. And then it turns out that there was a delegation of the Osage and some others that a French explorer brought to Paris around the same time that, or actually a little before, Montesquieu was writing. Now, why? Why, Felicia, would we care if they influenced Montesquieu or not?
Because Montesquieu also pushed for personal liberty.
Yeah, so what's interesting here is that Montesquieu writes this book that is said to be the ones that the founding fathers are reading. And here you can see a whole book on Montesquieu that says the French philosopher who shaped modern government. Basically, the whole idea that people live in these democratic nations and the way that politics should be organized is often traced to Montesquieu. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is what's interesting is, at least to me, is there are some people who have claimed that, the ideals of democracy in the United States come from the indigenous peoples, come from the Native Americans. And there are others that are like, no, that's crazy. There's no way. They did not. The founding fathers, were reading Montesquieu and the French Enlightenment figures. So were not related to, their ideas were not related to the Indigenous Americans. But the weird thing about that is that Montesquieu and others in the French Enlightenment were themselves talking to and reading ideas that were at least purported to come from the Indigenous Americas. So if the founding fathers were reading Montesquieu, indeed, in fact, yes, you've made a little circle. We have come full circle because, in fact, don't be fooled. Just because you say you're citing Montesquieu, if Montesquieu is citing the Indigenous Americans, then there we are, back full circle, just like we want it to be. So, their big claim here is that these ideas, liberty, neutralizing arbitrary power, political equality, and mutual aid, looking out for each other, are not simply human nature. So Rousseau and other people wanted to argue that these are the things that would be people in a state of nature. This is the way humans naturally are. And we've dispensed with that argument multiple times, but just to be clear, this is what some people were saying. This is the way people were like before the fall, before the private property. But they're also arguing against the idea that this is simply just the way culture happened among the Indigenous Americans. So often anthropologists will say, certain people value individual liberty and certain people don't, and who knows why, it's just culture. Culture does these things. And so anthropologists will often, without making much of a historical account, will divide up the world into these areas and say that certain groups like certain things. What they're trying to argue is that these ideas that the indigenous people were espousing in the Americas and later in some form or another, and there are a lot of ways these ideas get transformed and redebated and people would steal from each other and plagiarize and make things up too. So it becomes a little bit hard to trace. But the idea is that these were a product of a very specific political history or struggles that went on within indigenous societies, because there were other forms available. There were other political forms that were possible, and they would debate and reject them. And so what they're trying to tell us is that this was one of a number of political possibilities, and that the indigenous societies to the Americas were debating these, were in some cases people would try to seize power. And so you were always aware that this possibility existed, that people could try to take over, that their political societies were not just out of the Garden of Eden rising up from nothing. They were people thinking about them and reflecting upon them and creating different forms of polities. In general, they took an anti-authoritarian direction. And I say in general because there were some societies which maintained more forms of kingship, monarchy, like the Natchez. And the anti-authoritarian direction came about in part because of the experience of Cahokia and a reaction to the authoritarian direction that they had been taken. Now they support that with the idea it's kind of there's some passages in this chapter which get very long and detailed, and so we're kind of skimming through them. They support that with the idea of looking at Iroquoian witchcraft or witchcraft accusations. And they say that one of the things you can do in anthropology, if you want to know what people think of as the worst possible thing that you can do in a society, look to what they think of about witchcraft. And in this case, the Iroquois would consider that the worst possible thing you could do is give people orders, tell them what to do. That would be almost as abhorrent as eating human flesh. So you don't want to do that. Like I said, some of this history is detailed in ways that we don't want to dwell upon. I was really interested in this history from pages 490 to page 491, where you had, this is up around the time of Denonville, apparently, who invites the League Council of the Iroquois to negotiate terms for peace. And then he arrests them all and sends them to France as enslaved people on a galley ship, which is very mean. But there was one known as the Jigun SASE, who did not attend, a woman who raises an army and then triumphs over Denonville. So much triumph, as they put it, a far superior military tactician to Denonville, so much triumph that around Montreal they burned a bunch of stuff, and so the French eventually had to sue for peace. I was trying to look this up. How many, I only think, was anyone else except Liz subjected to the New York State school system, public school system? Ah, yes, too, yeah. I don't know if you remember Denonville at all. In New York State, I think he's the person who attacked upstate New York from the French side. So that's how we see him from us. But in this story, it's much more of a story of how he eventually has to sue for peace to the indigenous societies. Now, the point of this story is actually that here we have a superior military leader who then could have taken authoritarian control, and instead she regathers the grand councils and the different mechanisms of making decisions in a more democratic way. So, on page 492, we have the kind of summary paragraph of how this comes full circle. Gabe, how does it work? What were the indigenous Americans able to avoid?
They were able to avoid the trap of like
the trap, they sidestepped the agricultural evolutionary trap. So the idea that everything, remember how the idea that everything has to go from bands to tribes to chieftains to states, and that corresponds to these stages of evolution, and that corresponds to ever more authoritarian politics. They go up to, they reject agriculture at various stages. They go back and forth. They put it in its place. They go from having seasonal states, and then they reject all that. And they develop, well, one thing they develop is a tradition of prolonged political argument, which we've been talking about. Smoke tobacco and you talk politics and you argue about what the way things should have been, could have been. It was an emphasis on individual liberty, again, as we've been talking about, this idea of freedom. And who does this influence, Gabe? Those Enlightenment thinkers. So we went on and on about Montesquieu, but we could talk about others, this idea of individual liberty and prolonged political argument about what society should be. And interestingly, Graeber Wengrow end this chapter by saying the Wendat, the Indigenous Americans or Antiauthoritarian, or the people who were arguing for liberty, won the argument. It would be impossible for a European today, or anyone really, certainly true in the United States, whatever they actually thought, to take a position like that of the 17th century Jesuits and simply declare themselves opposed to the very principle of human freedom. So today, people might not really believe in human freedom, but you have to say that you believe in human freedom, because we're all supposed to believe in freedom. Whereas back in the day, the Jesuits, the European missionaries and others, said that it was wrong to have freedom, that you should submit to God and the church. And so their claim here is that the Wendat won the argument. And I wanted to kind of fast forward to today's world. We often talk about the peoples as if they were in the past and now they're gone, but they're not gone. And in fact, some of these indigenous areas and what we call reservations or territories are establishing more autonomy. Some of them are getting bigger, able to buy more land and able to expand. And this is a thing of today, not just of a yesteryear. So there's still continue and I think will be perhaps even, we might say, more important in our political future. And that applies to the Osage as well. This was an article in Bloomberg from not too long ago. So the Osage, as we recall, were a very powerful trading empire. And then they basically were, like many, were forcibly relocated. However, they were one of the few groups, because they did have some money, they bought their own reservation. And so they purchased this land in Oklahoma, including the mineral rights. So later on, oil was found there. Now, this was not the best thing, because as the Bloomberg article puts it, there was a lot of conflict and stealing and business deals which tried to take away the oil, and it was pretty bad. But they've won some court cases recently, and are basically trying to actively buy back a whole bunch of land. Maybe not all the land in red, but at least the land that was around their reservation. I think a few years ago, they bought a big ranch from Ted Turner, who was a broadcaster, rich guy. So, you know, these are actually going to be very active issues for the United States in the coming years, not just the years of before. But land is power, and the Osage Nation is buying theirs back.